Okay, so this is a study I ran as part of my PhD, and it's been submitted to a journal already, but I'm very keen to hear any thoughts and feedback you have. Okay, so many of you are probably already aware that weight-based discrimination is quite pervasive, particularly in developed and Western societies. And it's also seen as being quite legitimate as well. So interestingly, it's not just those who we might think of as outgroup members who are not a higher weight and therefore not the targets of this discrimination. It's not just those people that see this discrimination as being legitimate and sort of justified, but actually it also people who are a higher weight and who are subjected to this discrimination also often see it as being quite legitimate as well, which is very interesting. And there's a lot of research now that's found pretty consistent evidence that exposure to weight-based discrimination has pretty negative effects on our health and well-being, on people's health and well-being. And there's just some examples there on the screen. So it's been found to reduce self-control, self-esteem and body satisfaction, and increases risk of disordered eating, stress and psychological distress as well. So we have some pretty consistent evidence now that weight-based discrimination is bad. And research is starting to move more towards trying to understand kind of how weight-based discrimination influences health and well-being, why it has these negative effects, and under what circumstances do these negative effects occur, or perhaps what protective factors might there be. So far, this research has predominantly focused on the sort of individual level factors like the stress that being discriminated against causes, and also things like the degree to which high weight people actually perceive that they are being discriminated against. But little research has surprisingly looked at weight-based discrimination from an intergroup perspective. And I think most of us here would agree that the social identity approach is quite well placed to address this gap. So we know from the social cure research that our social identities have the potential to have a really positive effect on our health and well-being. They can give us a sense of belonging, can provide a source of social support and self-esteem. And research is increasingly finding that harnessing our social identities can reduce the severity of things like depression and anxiety and loneliness. But when one's group is discriminated against, this can actually threaten group members' identification with the group, and being a member of this disadvantaged group can actually be harmful to health and well-being rather than boosting or protecting it. But I think it's important that, we always recognize that people are not just passive recipients of discrimination. They're going to respond to this discrimination in one way or another. And some of these coping responses might be protective for their health, and some may be harmful or fail to protect. So according to the social identity approach, there are a number of factors that influence how people cope with group-based discrimination, and I'm going to talk about two of those today. So the first is the extent to which group members see the discrimination against their group as being legitimate, as being kind of fair and justified. And then the second is the extent to which they see their group's boundaries as being permeable. And what I mean by permeability here is basically the extent to which they believe it's possible for them to leave their disadvantaged group and move to another group, ideally a more advantaged one. And I suppose also conversely, how possible they think it is for people who are not part of that group to become group members. So if we think about this in the context of a weight-based groups, how easy is it for, or how possible is it for someone who's a higher weight to lose enough weight to leave that group and join a lower weight group? And how easy is it for lower weight group members to leave their group and join a higher weight group? So it's just kind of a way of thinking about essentially the controllability of weight and how that influences group membership. So if the response to these two questions here is yes, group members see this discrimination as being legitimate and the group boundaries are permeable, then we would predict that group members would be more likely to cope with discrimination by engaging in individual mobility. So this is essentially where they sort of disidentify or reduce the extent to which they identify as a member of that group and try to leave the group. And we see this in the real world. We see high weight people trying all sorts of diets and exercise regimes to try to lose weight. And also you see people who are a lower weight being very concerned about gaining weight. But if group members see the discrimination as being illegitimate and they see their group's boundaries as being impermeable, they don't think it's really that possible for them to leave their group in the first place, then they're more likely to cope by sort of challenging the status quo and advocating for social change and sort of coming together as a group. And again, we see this in the real world. We see all sorts of movements. You may have heard of the fat acceptance movement or size acceptance movement, health at every size, body positivity. So these are all examples of higher weight people kind of coming together and standing up and saying, no, this discrimination that we are constantly being subjected to is not okay. It's not fair. And also really promoting the idea that, you know, weight loss is really not that possible and that we should love our bodies as they are. So I think, you know, I really kind of see all of this stuff playing out, and being someone who has a background in social identity, you know, I really see this very clearly, but no one's actually empirically tested whether this is actually what's going on and shown the kind of empirical evidence for these kinds of relationships. So that's kind of what we set out to start addressing. So we wanted to know how does the perceived legitimacy of weight-based discrimination among in-group members and the perceptions of the permeability of their group's boundaries affect their identification with their higher weight groups, so specifically looking at higher weight people, and their intentions to advocate for social change on behalf of the group. So we focused on the collective action here. And also we looked at the impact on body satisfaction and self-esteem, which are two factors that have been found to be negatively affected by weight-based discrimination and are associated with well-being. And then we were also interested in looking at whether group identification was the mechanism through which these effects on collective action and body satisfaction and self-esteem occurred. And sorry, I forgot to say at the beginning, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to be interrupted if something kind of comes up and you need clarification. So I'm happy for that. Please just interrupt away. Okay, so what we did to sort of answer these questions was we conducted an experimental study. We did this on MTurk. So we had a screening questionnaire first that was just kind of a few demographic questions, and then those MTurkers who were found to have a self-reported BMI of 30 or above, which is what we were classifying as higher weight in this study. They were then sort of told that, you know, based on your responses, you have a BMI of 30 or above. This makes you eligible for participation in the study, in the another study, and they were invited to participate in the full study. And so that's kind of how we managed to get that sample. So we focused on manipulating legitimacy appraisals, and then we measured permeability. So legitimacy was our sort of primary focus in this study. So first, all participants read this statement, and we wanted to just kind of acknowledge that people do have different preferences in terms of like what kind of terminology they prefer when talking about body sizes. And this is a sort of ongoing debate in both the community and also within the among researchers in the weight stigma space, and everyone seems to have a different opinion, and different journals have different rules about what kind of language you can and can't use. So we wanted to just be really clear that we're going to use the term higher weight, and when we're talking about higher weight, we're talking about people with a body mass index of 30 or above, and they'd been told already that, you know, you are part of this group. And then they were told that we had previously interviewed some other higher weight North Americans, so in-group members, and we asked them to tell us whether they thought weight-based discrimination was legitimate or not. And then participants were randomly assigned to view some quotes from these in-group members that either supported the idea that the in-group members saw weight-based discrimination as legitimate or illegitimate. So they were randomly assigned to one of those two conditions. And this is just an example of what those quotes look like. So we tried to make them pretty similar across the two conditions, and just in one kind of changing it so that it was either saying, yes, I think this is justifiable, this is fair, or no, it's not justifiable, it's not fair. Okay, and then as I said before, we measured perceptions of group boundary permeability, and we worded this, it's sort of similar to measures that just assess the extent to which weight is controllable, but we tried to word it in a way that was more kind of group specific as well. And we measured identification with the FISI scale. We came up with a measure of collective action intentions. For example, would they sign a petition calling for government support? And this is just the extent to which they were willing to engage in 5 different collective action behaviours. And then body satisfaction and self-esteem. Okay. So we didn't find a direct effect of the experimental condition on our outcomes. So that's not what we expected. So there was no main effect of whether participants were told that their in-group members legitimized weight-based discrimination or didn't. But we did find a direct effect of perceptions of group boundary permeability on all of our outcomes. So basically across the board, the more permeable participants saw those group boundaries to be, so the kind of more possible they thought it was to lose enough weight to leave the high weight group. These participants then reported lower group identification, lower intentions to engage in collective action on behalf of their group, and also lower body satisfaction and self-esteem. And then we found an interaction between the legitimacy condition and perceptions of group boundary permeability only on group identification, which was the mediator that we were interested in looking at. So we found that for those who saw those group boundaries as not being very permeable, they didn't really think it was possible to leave their higher weight group via weight loss. They were kind of scoring pretty consistently around the midpoint of the scale in terms of how much they identified with their higher weight group. And this was regardless of whether they were told that their in-group members legitimized weight-based discrimination or not. But among those who thought that their group boundaries were more permeable, that leaving the group was possible, this is where we found the effect of legitimacy appraisals, where those who were told that that their in-group members saw weight-based discrimination as being legitimate and sort of fair and justified, these participants reported the lowest identification with their higher weight group. And as a result, for those participants, they also then in turn reported significantly reduced intentions to engage in collective action and reduced body satisfaction and self-esteem. So this kind of suggests that for this particular group of participants, by identifying less with their higher weight group, this group membership, being a member of the higher weight group, made them feel quite bad about themselves. They're less satisfied with their bodies. They reported lower self-esteem. Sorry? Did someone ask a question?
No, I think we just got some feedback from someone.
Oh,
okay. So,
okay,
yeah.
No worries.
Unmute this in the audience. That sounds good. Yeah, continue.
Okay. Yeah, so these participants then felt, less satisfied with their bodies, reported lower self-esteem, and were less likely to engage in collective action. And I would predict that these participants would have also been more likely to say that they had intentions to try to leave the group through maybe going on a diet or trying to sort of lose weight in some way. So those more individual mobility strategies, but unfortunately we didn't actually measure individual mobility. So something to look at next time. All right, so just to summarize, so we found that both perceptions of legitimacy and permeability of group boundaries are important to consider when trying to understand how people cope with discrimination, and particularly in this context when you're looking at weight-based discrimination. And in this study, we found that when high weight people believed it was possible to leave their group, having that weight-based discrimination legitimized by their in-group members significantly diminished their sort of already low group identification. And as a result, they were less likely to advocate for social change on behalf of the group. Oh, and I should also have in there that do I have another thing here? No. They were less likely to advocate for social change, and also were less satisfied with their bodies and had lower self-esteem. Okay. Not sure what's going on with my things here, but anyway, and I think it's interesting to kind of, if you frame it a little bit differently, these findings also highlight potential protective effects. So if in-group members delegitimize weight-based discrimination and they see those boundaries as being less permeable, then high weight people may identify more with their high weight group, and this may not only increase collective action responses, or at least prevent them from being reduced, but they may also protect them against additional sort of negative effects on body satisfaction and self-esteem.